The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, illustrated by Geoffrey Thompson. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfire arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. One if by land, and two if by sea, and I the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Then he said good night, and with muffled oar silently rowed to the Charlestown shore, just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her mooring lay the Somerset British man-of-war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar, across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile his friend, through alley and street, wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barricade door, the sound of arms and the trample of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed the tower of the old North Church by the wooden stairs with steady tread to the belfire chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the sombre rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade, by the trembling ladder steep and tall to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath the churchyard lay the dead, in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel tread, the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent, and seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour, and the secret dread of the lonely belfire and the dead. For suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed at the landscape far and near, then impetuous stomped the earth, and turned and tightened his saddle's girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfire tower of the old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and sombre and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfire's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full in his sight a second lamp in the belfire burns. A hurry of hoof in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath, from the pebbles, in passing a spark, struck out by a steed flying, fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the majestic meeting the ocean tide, and under the addles that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the trample of his steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town, he heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises after the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the guided weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting-house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectacular glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees. He felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown, and one was safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest in the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo for evermore. For borne on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoof-beats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. A historical note. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's stirring poem of the events leading up to the Battle of Lexington and Concord made Paul Revere a folk hero for generations of Americans. But Longfellow's poem is not an actual historical account. In fact, Paul Revere never even made it to Concord. What was the true story of Paul Revere's ride? It goes like this. The American Revolution had not yet started on the 18th of April in 1775. So far the colonists had only been protesting and arguing to try to get England to treat them more fairly. But there were many who thought that the colonies should break away from England, and some had started to collect guns and ammunition, so they would be ready to fight if necessary. The British knew the rebels were preparing for war and were worried. Whenever they could, they seized guns and ammunition from the rebels to keep them from growing too strong. On the night of April 18th, a British force of about 700 men left for Boston. They were planning to surprise the town of Concord and seize colonial ammunition stored there, but patriots had been spying on the British troops for some time and had caught wind of the plan. That night, silversmith Paul Revere and shoemaker William Dawes set off to sound the alarm. Besides alerting the countryside, they also helped to warn 2 rebel leaders in Lexington, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Revere had been an active revolutionary for some time. He had helped plan the Boston Tea Party, and some think that he participated in it as well. He had spied on British troops' movements around Boston, and he had ridden back and forth to Philadelphia several times, carrying news to and from the Constitutional Congress. The weekend before, Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the last leaders of the independent movement, still in Boston, had assigned Revere and Dawes to spread the news of the British troops' movements. Worried that he might not get out of Boston safely, Revere asked a friend to hang signal lanterns in the town of Christ Church in Boston. The signals would let patriots across the river know whether the British were marching out of Boston by land or rowing across the Charles River by sea. That way, even if Revere was spotted from leaving Boston, others could carry the news to Lexington and Concord. But in the end, signals weren't necessary. Revere avoided capture and was roused across the river by 2 friends. In Charlestown, he borrowed a horse and set off for Lexington, stopping at each house to call the patriots to arms. Arriving at Lexington at midnight, Revere alerted Adams and Hancock, and they were joined by Dons, who had taken another route from Boston. They started for Concord. Just outside Lexington, another patriot, Dr. Samuel Prescott, joined them. The three men continued toward Concord, stopping at every house to spread the alarm. On the way, a British patrol stopped the men and tried to arrest them. Prescott knew the area well and escaped immediately by jumping his horse over a stone wall. He galloped to Concord. A little later, Dons fled back to Lexington on foot. Revere was not so lucky. The British held him for a couple of hours and then let him go without his horse. He never got to Concord, but he did return to Lexington in time to witness the battle there. The redcoats arrived in Lexington on the morning of April 19th. About 70 patriots were ready, lined up on the village green, and the first battle of the Revolution began. No one knows who fired the first shot, but when the fighting stopped, 8 patriots lie dead, and the redcoats had won. The British marched on to Concord, sure that the militia there could be defeated as easily as the one in Lexington. But Prescott had arrived with his warning, and more than 300 patriots lay in wait at North Barrett Bridge. In the fighting, 3 redcoats and 2 rebels were killed. With more patriots arriving, the British turned around and retreated to Boston. As the British marched back to Boston, they were met by patriots who had been roused by Revere, Dawson, and Prescott, and were on their way to join the battle in Concord. When these patriots saw British marching away from Concord, they attacked. By the time they reached Boston, the British had lost 200 men, and the Revolutionary War had begun.